Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Finding You podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about self care, and I'm actually going to talk about it in a way that I've been thinking about it lately with some new ideas. So, this is one of my favorite old podcasts. This is one that I get a lot of feedback. A lot of people write to me about talking about how important this topic is for them, how difficult and challenging this topic is for them. And today, like always, I want to peel back and look at the bigger questions that are involved in self-care. What prevents it? What gets in the way? What kind of battles do we have to face in order to practice a healthy kind of self-care? Before that, I want to talk about the one or two things that we have coming up. We have the January 15th through 19th Finding You workshop intensive. That's the one that we do in person outside of Park City, Utah. We have a couple of spots left. If you are interested, don't wait, don't delay. That's going to fill up. The one after that will be February 19th through 23rd. We also have an online option, January 21st. That's a Friday afternoon until the afternoon or evening of January the 26th. It's kind of like half of the Finding You. It's the first part of it. It's about a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. So there's benefit to that if resources are tight for you. We have the Conscious Parenting Workshop. That's the last thing I want to just put out there for you. January 10th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I'm going to be leading a class. We're going to cap it at 20 participants. So that gives you the opportunity to have it really be an interactive class instead of me just lecturing like you get from these podcasts. It could be something where you bring your specific questions in. We'll be talking about attachment theory, what it means to be a conscious parent, what are the things that get in the way, and what are the basic skills and tools that lead us into this greater awareness. So let's get into tonight's topic about self-care, gifts for the self. Obviously, the gifts for the self part is related to the holidays. This is a time of gift giving, a time of gratitude. For a lot, of course, it can be a very challenging time, as it might be an anniversary of something that was sad or difficult for you, or it might be a reminder, an elevator holiday, if you will, what brings you back to a previous time in your life. But in general, we talk about gifts during this time of year. We talk about giving this time of year. So tonight, I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of your relationship with yourself. And like I always talk about, that's the foundation. The bigger question that I want to ask tonight, have you ask, invite you to ask yourself is, what does my relationship with myself look like? Can I hold myself in compassion? That idea of the inner child that we so much that we explore so much of when you come to an intensive, the inner child is this construct. It's this idea, this thought experiment where we imagine ourselves as young, and really what we're doing is we're bringing ourselves back to the version of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that existed before the world told us who we should be. James Hollis said, and I think this is one of the foundational principles or ideas of all of Finding You. This is on the first page of our new website. The quote says, "The truth about intimate relationships is that they can never be any better than the relationship that we have with ourselves." People around you will only love you as much as you love yourself. That is, you'll need to assert yourself, to set boundaries, to ask for your needs to get met. And this can only happen to the extent that you've worked out your shame and guilt and are available to honor yourself. While boundaries are not meant to change others, boundaries are kind of the action item when we think about self-care. When you set boundaries around people, the people around you will change. You'll find different people. I talk about it in terms of, it's not about setting a boundary, about it asserting a boundary. It's about requiring certain things, certain ways of talking, certain ways of relating to you. I don't want to sound too extreme, because these ideas, the things that I'm about to say, I don't want it to be thought of as too rigid and too far. But in essence, it's as if people have to earn their time around you. Now, that doesn't, of course, apply to young children, to our children in a lot of ways. But as our children age and become more responsible for their own lives, their own dents and their own bruises, even if those dents and bruises, metaphorically speaking, came from us, it's still important for them to recognize that you matter. But first, the idea here is tonight is you have to know that you matter. I just finished running the Finding You, the December Finding You intensive. We had a beautiful time, a wonderful time. And on the last night, one of the participants said, and many chimed in about this idea that it all comes back to guilt and shame, to this idea of aspiring to be right and good instead of to be who you are. Inevitably, no matter what your position is, no matter what you define self-care as, no matter what activities, and I'll talk about some examples today about what self-care can look like, no matter what all of that looks like to you, you will inevitably bump up against guilt in your effort to practice greater self-care. That is the sentinel. That is the dragon that stands guard at the entrance, or the exit, I should say, to the cave or the prison that we find ourselves stuck in. So if you struggle to set boundaries, think about it in the most everyday term. If you think about setting a boundary with somebody that you love, somebody in your closer circle, and you find yourself being hesitant, what are you afraid of? What's the hesitancy about? And most often it is, number one, you're afraid that this specific person is going to respond with hurt, with anger, with some kind of response that's going to be punishing in some way. Maybe it might be distance, maybe it might be aggression, whatever it is. And because essentially we were met by that same reaction, those same kind of energies as children, primarily with our parents, but not just with our parents, with the siblings, if we had siblings, with our schoolmates, our classmates, our peers, and eventually with the other big people in our lives, our extended family and our teachers. We were met with that kind of resistance. Remember, on the receiving end of a boundary, think about this in your own body. On the receiving end of a boundary, it's so often hurtful. Even when somebody's saying it well and asserting it clearly, even when they're identifying that it's about their need to take some space, to take a night off, to walk away, to say no to an event or an invitation, to end a conversation, to say goodbye. When many of us are on the receiving end of that, even if we have an ability to regulate our nervous system to a large extent, it can still feel like a small hurt, a small rejection. So we have to walk past that discomfort. And to do that, we have to value the relationship with ourselves more than belonging. And again, tonight, I'm not talking about some kind of one-size-fits-all, some kind of rigid stance where you're setting boundaries. I've been told that when people are listening to my discussions around boundaries and around self-care, that they perceive that I'm preaching, teaching, advocating, and inviting for this really selfish, self-centered, rigid perspective. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that for most of us that do this work, most of the people that I find that show up to psychotherapy or show up to our workshops or intensives, they struggle setting boundaries because they're worried about the reaction. They're worried about how people are going to push them away, punish them. That in essence, even in the act of setting a boundary, they might be abandoned. They call these feelings guilt. I feel bad. If the feelings become more intense, it can even rise to the level where we call it shame. And I don't distinguish between guilt and shame in terms of the old adage, guilt is feeling bad for what you do and shame is feeling bad for who you are. I don't distinguish between those two, because I think they are, at least in my experience, in the way that people use those words day to day, they're more of a distinction between intensity than they are a type or a kind. So we have to love ourselves. We have to walk past the guilt, the shame, the messages from our past, the message that we've internalized that we should be selfish, selfless, that we should help when somebody's in need. I was telling this story at the intensive. When I was a teenager, I was given the book by my therapist. I wasn't a big reader as a youth, but this was one of the books that I read front to back. I was given the book Illusions by Richard Bach. You might recognize his name. He's the author of his most famous work is Jonathan Livingston Seagull. But in the book Illusions, the adventures of a reluctant Messiah, they show this master teacher, this master Messiah, training this apprentice Messiah. That's the language, that's the framework of the book. And during one of their evening sessions, sitting around a campfire out in the wilderness, They're talking about this idea of love. And the master says to the apprentice, what is love? What does it mean to love somebody? And the apprentice says something along the lines of to give somebody what they need in times of need, to give of yourself, your time, your energy, your finances, whatever it is, to give it of somebody that you care about, somebody who needs. Just then, due to the magic of the Messiah, he conjures up Count Dracula to come out of the bushes, come out of the trees. And as he appears, the apprentice is startled by the appearance of Count Dracula, as we all would be. In this particular appearance, Count Dracula looks absolutely horrible, starving, dying of thirst for blood, and says to the two people sitting around the small fire that they built that he needs just a little bit of blood. And the apprentice, not privy to this whole lesson, this whole conjuring, gets very afraid and eventually angry and threatening. As Dracula asks very gently and approaches and asks for more blood, eventually the apprentice threatens, the apprentice Richard actually threatens that he's going to hurt or attack or kill Dracula. And at that moment, Dracula disappears. And the Master Messiah says to the apprentice, do you want to reconsider your definition of love? Love starts with us. I remember for many years, and it started in my undergraduate career, we would talk about love of self and love of others. And oftentimes the question was couched in terms of what comes first. You know, some people teach, even in the 12-step programs, they talk about how service to others can be an important part of recovery and mental health. I know people in all kinds of contexts, including religious, that will talk about service to others as a path to self-esteem and self-worth and self-care and self-love and gratitude. And while the direction of things might go in that direction for some people sometimes, it is my experience as a psychotherapist that self-love, like James Hollis says, is the pattern, the template upon which all of our relationships rest. I was talking to a client this morning, and she was telling me about a response that she wanted to have to her family about something as she was going through a very difficult time at work. But as she told me this story, she said, but you know, when I've heard people say things like I want to say to them, I've thought of them as selfish or immature or unaware. But now I'm in this crisis. I need this. And so I'm stuck between the judgment that I've had for people that do this and the compelling need that I have in the situation. And I said to her, well, part of that awareness can not hopefully just lead you to not ask for your needs, but maybe you can become less judgmental of people who do this, who ask for what you need to ask for. Maybe that's the lesson. That now you are the one in the hole, in the abyss, in the dark place. You can rethink, reconsider the way that you've thought about other people. Like I've said, if there isn't self-love, then our interactions with other people will be in service of our ego, of our desire to be good, to be the hero, to be the good person, the good friend, the good spouse, the good parent. It's only when our service is built on a foundation of some kind of self-love that it really can be in the service of love. I have enough, and I have enough left over to give. Something as simple as somebody asking you to listen to them vent. If you show up to that conversation because you want to be a good friend or a good spouse, what will typically or often occur in that interaction is your feelings will betray you. They'll expose you. If you're empty, if you're not full up. But if you're full up and taking care of yourself, feeling settled, feeling some kind of peace, some kind of baseline of strength and comfort and capacity, then you are available to the friend. So we show up when we can. Back to what that participant at Finding You this last week rediscovered or discovered again was the idea that The real issue here is our attachment to the idea of being good. The idea that the goal of life is to be a good person. And the problem with that idea is it ruins your life. It destroys everything. And oftentimes outside of your awareness. If you need to be good, that means that the people that you care about and are close to you have to support that agenda. They are less free to have feelings of anger and disappointment and resentment and frustration and hurt from you. And if you're clinging to that idea, that hope, that drive, that ambition to be good, you'll have that defense up, right? You'll have to explain to them how they simply misunderstood or didn't see your intentions, how they didn't see your behavior, your acts as an act of kindness and love. You'll defend yourself. You'll defend yourself against the threat that you're being told implicitly that you are bad, because only a bad person would cause pain to someone that they love, is the deep down thought. So to practice self-care, you're going to go to battle with shame. You're going to go to battle with guilt. You're going to be asked, and I like to think of the inner child, do you care enough about that inner child? The thought experiment of imagining the inner child, one of the reasons that I think it helps people is because it is somebody else, right? You can picture your young self. I have a picture of myself on the shelf behind me as a child to remind me. I picture that little boy. And can I attend to his needs? Can I care for him in the same way that I want to care for others? If you haven't watched the movie Wicked, which is part one of the musical that was on Broadway, I should warn you that there's a spoiler here. But in essence, the climax of the movie, of Act One in the Broadway musical, is when the witch discovers that the wizard is asking her to betray herself, to betray her own ethics, her own integrity, to belong. That's essentially what the climax is about. And that's what the song Defying Gravity is about. And what she yells, screams beautifully just before she launches into the chorus, she says, if this is love, it comes at much too high a cost. The question becomes, are the people around you, the situations, the way that you've set up your life, is it asking you to sacrifice you for belonging? And that is ultimately the greatest threat to us. Because wired into our DNA is this need for connection, this need for belonging, this need to be part of something bigger. It is genetically hardwired into every cell in our body. It is what made us survive as a species. So anything that threatens connection, threatens potential alienation, annihilation, is going to be difficult to overcome. So I'll talk about that dynamic tonight, about boundaries, about triggers and keys. From The Dance of Anger, my favorite book by Harriet Lerner, my favorite book about boundaries, happens to be written by Harriet Lerner. She says, one of her clients says in one of the case studies in the book, she says, no matter how long I'm in therapy, I'm still going to feel guilty if I say no to my father. This is an adult woman speaking whose father has increasing needs of her time and attention as she's taking care of her own family, her family of creation, her procreation. No matter how long I'm in therapy, she says, I'm still going to feel guilty if I say no to my father. But if I keep saying yes, I'm going to feel angry. So if I'm going to change, I guess I'll just have to learn to live with some guilt for a while. That paragraph changed my life. It didn't solve all of my guilt, didn't wipe it away. But now I understood, when I read that, I understood the project. I have to grapple with guilt. And for me, the one indication that I'm making any kind of progress in the area of self-care is most obviously, the most obvious signal is the guilt that I feel. To say no, to take my own time, to take some space. From The Eden Project by James Hollis, we read, Mahatma Gandhi once remarked, "A coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave." Projection, fusion, going home is easy, while loving another's otherness is heroic. If we really love as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility for our own individuation and our own journey. And this heroism may properly be called love. So that's the recipe. If you're going to love others, you first have to love yourself, get to know yourself. You first have to differentiate or individuate. That's not a selfish act. That's the act of embracing and loving who you are. I've said this even as recently as last week on these broadcasts. If you don't have compassion for poor, dying, hurt, desperate people, you haven't learned enough self-love. Because if you loved yourself, truly loved yourself, as a self, you would recognize yourself in the eyes of everybody that you see. And that's the work. The work is to overcome the shame, to have somebody walk alongside of you, to carry the guilt with you. The guilt that is inevitable in your process toward individuation, toward becoming yourself. I think about this idea of the skills versus the deeper work. I wrote this week on my social media, I said, boundaries are not necessarily walls. Think of boundaries as doors that tell others how to relate to you in order to feel connected, to stay connected. I'm telling you this not to push you away, but because I value our relationship. In other words, our relationship is worth the risk of me saying something difficult and scary. You can say that to them. You can preface your boundary with that. You can say it as you're setting your boundary, or you can just think it. The reason I'm taking this risk, I think about this with my wife all the time. The reason it's worth it to me to say difficult and scary things to her. And I'm not talking about feedback. I'm talking about self-care and boundaries, feelings that I'm having, is because the relationship is worth it. And frankly, if the relationship doesn't matter to me, I'm not going to take that risk. I'm not going to risk feeling shame and guilt. That overcomes my whole body with nothing more. It's simply just a feeling bad. And why am I going to experience that, be willing to experience that if the relationship isn't important to me? This can be a great prelude, telling somebody that they matter to you and that's why you're expressing a scary, difficult boundary. It can be a great prelude to a difficult discussion about feelings. Telling the person that they're important enough to you to step outside of your comfort zone can help both people. Can be very disarming for the person on the other end. I saw this quote a while ago, and I've been quoting it since, but I went today to make sure that it was right from the right person. Apparently, John Lennon did say this. Being honest may not get you a lot of friends, but it'll always get you the right ones. What I learned when I made a big shift from active codependency, from trying to be good, from an ego-based life, from trying to get everybody to see me and find worth in me by my successes, my talents, my charisma, my speaking, my teaching, my degrees, my accomplishments. When I made that shift from that to being a self, to being myself, I was willing to do it at the cost of losing everybody. I was. I realized that if I didn't value myself, as messy as it was and would continue to be, if I didn't learn to love myself, then life wasn't worth living at all. And I lost friends, and I lost loved ones, and I lost some family members. Some of the people I lost surprised me, shocked me. Their judgments, their reactions as I made different decisions for myself in this life. But what was beautiful is the people that were left were my people. And people that I wasn't close to, we found each other. I found friends that could support me. I found friends that wouldn't judge me. I found friends that didn't have advice for me, that didn't think they knew what I should do, but simply honored me on my journey, could stay connected to me, loving me non-judgmentally, show compassion and empathy for whatever dilemma I might be going through. So boundaries aren't changing people around you, but if you set boundaries, the people around you will change. They'll be different people. Resentment, this is really important. Resentment is often a signal, not always, but often a signal of poor self-care. So if you're feeling resentful, especially if the resentment persists, then you take a step back and you look, am I asking this other person to do something for me that I need to do for myself? Am I hoping that this other person will meet my needs and respond to me in the ways that I want or the ways that I need without me having to push or ask for my needs? When I learned that resentment was often a signal of self-care, it put the responsibility squarely on my shoulders. And as a people pleaser, as a recovering people pleaser, I realized that when I feel resentment, I have fallen into that self-made prison. I like sometimes the comfort of feeling resentful and self-righteous, that I'm a better friend or a better spouse or a better parent than mine were. I that's a comfortable position for me to be in. Some people call that a victim or a martyr. Because that feeling of resentment and self-righteousness, for me, is much more comfortable than the guilt and the shame of asserting myself and asking for my needs to be met and the fear of rejection or abandonment. I would rather feel resentment than guilt and fear. And that was true up until I realized that the resentment was killing me and that nobody was coming to rescue me. I could go to my therapist and the people that were close to me that I trusted with for support, but ultimately I was going to have to do the most scary things. Resentment or anger can help us preserve the integrity of ourselves if we lean into it. It can motivate us to self-care, it can help us with boundaries. Anger, which resentment is kind of lingering anger, old stale anger is what I like to call it. Resentment is a signal that we are in a pattern in our relationships where we're expecting other people to take care of us just because we're nice people. In my codependency, I thought if I gave and gave and gave, that eventually everybody would treat me like I wanted to be treated. Not true. I found that they just took more and more because I was taking myself for granted. I was denying my needs. That was reflected in the people around me. So focusing on this idea that resentment is a sign or a signal from my body, from my unconscious, from my deeper self, my higher self, from my inner child. That was all from all those places that it was a sign that I wasn't taking good care of myself. Now I know what the project is. To face my guilt, to deconstruct it, to unravel it, to unpack it, to learn, to unlearn what I've been taught about right and wrong, good and bad. Resentment can give us permission to take care of ourselves. If our resentment builds to a high level, we'll actually take care of ourselves in very cruel ways to other people. Most people, for example, who betray their partners justify the betrayal with a significant amount of resentments. I deserve this. I'm not getting taken care of. I deserve to be happy. I deserve to be loved. I deserve to be wanted. And in that red hot, stuck resentment, anger place, they can behave in ways that abuse and neglect and betray everybody involved. So resentment can give us permission. If we don't let it toxify, it can give us permission to take better care of ourselves. Anger and resentment can help us protect ourselves from predators. That is why I think it's so important to teach the principle that learning to forgive somebody when they're still abusing you is crazy in a way. Unless, of course, that forgiveness comes with boundaries and self-care, Like, I need to keep you at a distance. I'm not going to invite you to my Thanksgiving table, for example. I'm not going to come over and visit. I can't be your business partner anymore. I can't be your friend anymore. But that act of distancing myself, that boundary, is self-preservation, right? Carrying around anger and resentment is dangerous, physically, medically dangerous, and of course, spiritually dangerous. So that can be a signal for self-care. That can be a way to protect us from people who would harm us. It's a sign that our rights, that our needs, that ourselves are being violated. We are being compromised. We're giving too much. And our unmet expectations, our unconscious strings are attached to those needs, turn into this resentment. Harriet Lerner said in her book, anger is a tool for change when it challenges us to become more of an expert on the self and less of an expert on others. The relationship between boundaries and self-care is absolutely inescapable. Boundaries are the act of self-care. Boundaries are what self-care looks like operationally. Boundaries are hard to understand because they're understood from the inside out. When I'm talking with a client, when I'm teaching, and I get quoted all the time about what people should and shouldn't do, even though I make it my practice, personally and professionally, especially professionally, not to use the word should, not to think the word should. I hear people quote me and say, Brad would tell you to do this, Brad would tell you to do that, which I would ask people to find where I tell people what to do in terms of the actions with others in their life, the big choices. But what I do invite people to do is look at the intentions, look at what's underneath it. And if you're setting boundaries to control somebody else, to change somebody else, I would warn you. Boundaries are more about here's what I need in this situation, in this relationship, in this role. You know, I have a role as a parent that I feel morally, ethically obligated to perform. I have a role as a citizen, as a friend, as a psychotherapist. And I honor all of those roles. And my boundaries can be thought of in those contexts. As a father, as a husband, as a therapist, as a friend. This is what I can feel good about. This is what I need. These are the doors. This is the door that you and I can go through to connect to each other. The external behavior, the actual choice of what I won't go to the movies, I will help you move, I won't. I will listen to, I won't. All of the actions for me are absolutely neutral. But it is why. Why are you doing that? What are you hoping for? Where's it coming from? Is it if it's coming from self-care and honoring yourself, great. If it's coming because if you think you set this boundary, you can flip this lever and flip this switch and push this button and get this person to think and feel differently, behave differently, you're in trouble. You have weaponized the idea of boundaries. Boundaries are beyond right and wrong. I wish I could hear what people think when I teach this idea about beyond right and wrong, or that the idea of being good is the surest thing to ruin your life. I would love to know if people hear that as amoral or immoral. But in my world, thinking in terms of right and wrong and good and bad is immoral. Or at least it's a more primitive, less evolved, less mature version of morality. The kind of morality that I'm teaching about is being true to yourself. And if that idea sounds dangerous or scary to you, I think you've been indoctrinated into the right and wrong doctrine. Because my experience as a psychotherapist is that people that are true to themselves and authentic to themselves are more loving, more generous, more kind, more caring, more compassionate, less judgmental, more authentic. And boundaries are beyond that. I've talked about this recently. In the context of codependency, if you think about active codependency versus codependency in remission or in recovery. Active codependency means that you're making decisions from the context, from the place of what can I do to get people to give me what I want and to change. And recovery from codependency is what can I do to make sure that I'm at peace with myself, that I'm in integrity, that I feel okay with myself as a self. That's the shift. It sounds overly simplified, but you will find it and you will hear it if you ever attend the meetings or read the books. People in recovery from codependency say, this is what I need, and I don't have to justify, because justifying is a defense against being wrong or bad. And if you've eradicated that thought process, that judgment, that idea, there's no reason for justification. So boundaries are beyond right and wrong. They're measured, the health of the boundary is measured by the intention, what is underneath and inside. And that's why it's difficult to explain, and they can't be recognized from the outside sometimes. Our insight about boundaries disappears in the face of stress, resistance, behaviors and patterns and reactions that remind us of times in our life when we were punished for our self-care as children. Our insight about our boundaries will absolutely disappear in the field of the gravitational pull of another person that's important to us, that we value. I think about communication. Communication, for me, the benefit of communication is it makes explicit all the things that are unconscious. I love my family and I talk about this all the time when we're watching television shows or talking about cases and talking about communication. We simply illustrate that you can hear. I love when people write letters to loved ones, because it's there. It's static on the piece of paper or on the email, right? On the document. And the words will expose whether or not you have healthy boundaries or not. Or whether you're assertively communicating them or trying to manipulate somebody else. So communication is a tool for us to become more conscious and to enter into relationships in a more conscious way. The question about enabling or rescuing, again, can be answered by what's your intent. Before you respond to a loved one in a difficult or an uncomfortable situation, ask yourself, am I trying to get them not to feel a certain way about me or about the situation? And if the reason behind what you're about to say or what you're saying is coming from that place, it's not a boundary. It's manipulation. It's a threat. It's coercion. It's some form of psychological blackmail. Sometimes the rescuing and the enabling is so that you don't feel guilty. You're really taking care of yourself. That's the great illusion with codependency. It's the illusion that you're taking care of somebody else when you're really taking care of yourself. And the shift between controlling behaviors versus influential behaviors is this shift from finding your center, speaking from your truth, putting it out there. The simplest way to talk about letting go and boundaries is, can you tell the truth? Why do we lie? Why do we exaggerate or leave parts out of what we're saying? We do all of that. We do that because we want to control what other people think and feel. Boundaries define where you stop and I start. And what does that mean? That means, what am I responsible for? You know, after the question, the most basic question, which is, who am I? Come to questions about our relationship. What is my relationship to my child, to my spouse? What's my responsibility here? If my wife is upset with me, is that my fault? If my child is upset with me or doesn't love me, is that my fault? And I think the answer to those questions will absolutely start to teach you, to tell you, to show you how differentiated and connected you are to people. The real task is to own your own feelings, own your own serenity. Be responsible for your happiness. Do you walk around thinking other people that life and other people and circumstances? I'm not saying there's not trauma. This life is difficult, impossibly difficult at times. But are you ultimately responsible for your feelings? Are your children responsible for their feelings? When they are upset, do you react as if you're responsible? Even if you're justifying and arguing and trying to prove your point, you are just as much held hostage by their feelings as if you were devolving into a puddle of guilt and self-pity. A self-righteous justification is just as compromised, just as unevolved as what we might consider self-pity. And in families that are more differentiated, that encourage boundaries, everybody's connected and empathic and compassionate, but not held hostage by somebody else's mood, feelings, or attitudes or beliefs. And what's the basis for the capacity to be disconnected from that, to detach from that stuff? It's how well you know yourself. If you know yourself well, which means that you love yourself, which means that you see the parts of yourself that you've been told to hate, and somebody comes up and calls you an idiot, it doesn't matter, because if you are, you are. And if you're not, you're not. And really what happens when you know yourself is now you can see other people as others. That's what that quote from Gandhi and Hollis means. Projection, fusion, going home is easy, he said. But loving another's otherness is heroic. And to love other as other, you have to take on the responsibility of your own differentiation, of your own life. The old adage from Al-Anon, what you think about me is not my problem, is none of my business, is kind of the epitome of a boundaried person. I'm accountable for me and my actions, and I have understanding about how it impacts you. Even compassion is a part of a healthy boundary. I'm not responsible for your actions at the end of the day, however. A healthy boundary person can communicate assertively, courageously, even shaking in their voice, rather than passively. Stop trying to get me to do something so that you feel okay, would be an idea, an energy in a boundaried person. I am responsible to take care of myself, and you are responsible to take care of yourself. Let me tell you what boundaries are not. Boundaries are not yelling, nagging, repetitive arguments and fights, comments, or even repeating I feel statements. Trying to guilt or shame others, blame others is not a boundary. Making excuses, owning, over identifying with our children, our spouses for their successes or failures is not a boundary. Resentments that linger or repeat themselves are examples of poor boundaries. Hoping that somebody will take care of us is not a boundary. That's because it's our job to take care of ourselves. And again, the minute you have enough self-love and self-value to take care of yourself, it will naturally shift where the people that are around you will care about you also, be sensitive to your needs. If you're too ashamed, and that can show up in a lot of ways, it can show up angry and cold, or it can show up dependent, erratic, overly emotional. Expecting or resenting others to act like we do or we would. I would never treat anybody that way. If I was you, that's what I would do. That's part of a non-boundaried person. Talking about or venting to somebody else. I'm not talking about a therapist. That's appropriate, or a sponsor, or a therapy group or a support group. I'm talking about talking to your child about your spouse. Talking to one friend about another. Talking to a coworker about somebody else at work. That's not boundaries. Not seeing our part in things, or thinking that thinking that guilt and blame are our moral North Stars are not boundaries. Not knowing that we're responsible for our own serenity. The essence of boundaries and self-care is ownership. Owning and or stating that our feelings are ours. Being responsible for our feelings. I say this all the time. Your parents dented you. You dented your children. You can't get away without that. You can't get away clean. But eventually the dents from our childhood are ours. And the dents that we've put in our children are theirs. And eventually we have to let go of hoping that our parents are going to finally change or expecting our children to forgive us. And we have to do the work of self-love and self-forgiveness. And that's related to responsibility and accountability. Being responsible for your feelings and truth, and avoiding the idea that others need to be shaped up or fixed or even okay with what you're saying. That's an act of self-love. That is self-care is a feeling, right? The words. We're talking about tonight as a verb, as an action, even a noun. But essentially, when you think about it, it's caring about yourself. Do you care and love yourself and your needs and your inner child, your higher self, your deepest self? A boundary is a boundary is a boundary. Going to meetings, watching webinars, attending therapy, telling your friends or a spouse how you want to be treated, telling the others in your life, you can't treat me that way. Those are not boundaries. And a boundary works because if the other person doesn't respond to it, you have an action item and it will be to go take care of yourself somewhere else. And if that persists, right? If it's a pattern, eventually that relationship won't exist anymore. It will exist at a great distance. Talking about boundaries, reading about boundaries, learning about boundaries, whining, threatening, warning, lecturing about boundaries are not boundaries. My experience is that most people, including therapists, fantasize that they're much better at boundaries than they are. The people that I know who do really well with boundaries know that it's an everyday struggle. Yes, they can recognize, I can recognize I'm better than I was 5 years ago. I'm better than I was 10 years ago, 15, and so forth. But I'm also aware that I have a long way to go. Boundaries are often this ownership. The avoidance is a way of avoiding how other people react to us. So what is self-care? Self-care is an assertive and honest acknowledgement of your needs. Starts with a request and an assertive, clear attempt on your part to meet your own needs. One of the things that I've learned is that more healthy people ask for their needs to be met, and more unhealthy people demand that their needs be met. And there's a difference. The more disordered somebody is, the more they demand and punish, full of rage when people don't meet their needs. The more evolved, the more healed, the more emotionally mature people are, the more they ask for their needs to be met and that set boundaries accordingly if they're not. Self-care is the awareness that you are in charge of taking care of your own needs. You are responsible. You are responsible for your life, for your happiness, for your serenity, not your children, not your spouse, not your friends, not the people at work. You. Now, of course, our needs are best served in relationship to lots of other people. But ultimately, you are the actor in this. You are the leading actor in your life. Self-care is a model for others that you follow, that you matter, that everybody matters. And this self-care fosters in you an empathic resonance for others. It's not guilting or blaming others for them not meeting your needs. It's not trying to passively get your needs met through other people. James Hollis said in the Eden Project, my favorite book on marriage, he said, it takes great courage to ask this fundamental question. What am I asking of this other that I ought to be doing for myself? If, for example, he says, I'm asking the other to be mindful of my self-esteem, I have a project waiting unaddressed. If I am expecting the other to be good, the good parent, and take care of me, then I have not grown up. If I'm expecting the other to spare me the rigor and terror of living my own journey, then I have abdicated from the chief task and most worthy reason for my incarnation on earth. Powerful words. Hollis talks a lot about the responsibility. Your boundaries can look like, self-care can look like rest and relaxation, vacation. It can look like staring at the wall and doing nothing, being alone, exercise, massages, nice dinners, special events. I want to differentiate a little bit between self-improvement and self-care. Self-care is not necessarily self-improvement. When I'm tuning out or relaxing, I'm not necessarily improving myself, but I'm improved by the act. I'm refilling my own tank, my own energy wells and resources. Hobbies, reading, TV. It's just spending time without judging it. Of course, the more difficult things like doctors, visiting the doctor, dentists, cleaning, that can be a part of self-care. Self-advocacy and assertion. Sometimes work can be self-care. I get a lot out of work. I've got a lot out of work when I travel. Boundaries are the emotional and psychological perimeter of the self. They can change and they don't have to be right. Self-care and boundaries sound like this is what I believe. This is what I can tolerate. This is for me. This is what I will allow in my life. This is what I will accept in my home. No. The word no is a boundary, is self-care. A big one. No is a complete sentence, as they say. I don't want to do that. I can't. I'm sorry, but I'm too tired. I need to stay in tonight. I'm at my limit. I'm not willing to do that. I need some time alone. All of these are what boundaries can sound like. You fill yourself up in order to give love to the people that need it most, starting with you. If you practice healthy self-care, practice of self-care, you won't steal from others. Others won't be burdened by you constantly. When Carl Jung said that the greatest burden for a child to bear is the unlived life of a parent, he was talking about self-care, amongst other things. Self-care presents martyrdom, resentment that lingers, the victim identity and blame. It models for our children healthy balance. If we can model self-care for our children, we give them an example of what it's like to expect relationships to be healthy, to treat them well. Self-care, it suggests to our children the need for empathy. I think a lot of parents have been taught that parenting is wholly a selfless activity, and that's not healthy for anybody, including the child. The fact that you have limits and needs means that the child has to understand and consider an other. You're not just modeling for them that you deserve it and you're worth it. You are by example modeling that they're worth it. And the fact of the matter is you need self-care whether you know it or not. We learn to make clear statements about ourselves, what we feel. The risks that Harriet Lerner talks about in her book around self-care is that we assume responsibility for other people's feelings and actions. We relinquish our primary responsibility to proceed with our own growth and ensure the quality of our own lives. We behave as if, she loves to talk about this, we behave as if having a relationship is more important than having a self. But remember, the self is the first and most important relationship. Everything is a template after that. And if you don't have a healthy relationship with the self, you can't have a healthy relationship with another person, no matter what. Because you're not present. Because it's not a real relationship with you. It's a relationship with part of you. So here are the take-homes. Progress, not perfection. It's a lifelong journey. Practice compassion for yourself and others. Forgive yourself for being imperfect. Even forgive yourself for being a perfectionist. Understand that our own programming has taught us how to think and feel about ourselves, and thus how to think and feel about others. We teach other people how to treat us not by complaining or teaching or expressing anger, but by our actions, by the way that we take care of ourselves. There is absolutely some risk of aloneness, of loneliness on this journey. We have to face our dragons. But if we defeat the dragon gives us the treasure that it has been protecting, hoarding. And the treasure that they give us is joy. Joy from knowing ourselves, joy from loving ourselves, which extends to the gift of wanting to give that kind of joy to everybody else in the world. Working on our boundaries will lead to a sense of empowerment, hope, and liberation. The individual that works on their boundaries will feel less depression, less resentment, and less anxiety. But first, they'll have to navigate through guilt and shame. We learn to tolerate guilt, remembering that it is not our conscience. It is most likely the parents and the programming of the dominant culture in which you grew up in. You'll have to learn, and therapy can help that. That can be your source. That can be the parent that you never had. That can be the big person in your life that was never there for you. Ultimately, along the path to discover that how other people respond to you is more about them than it is about you. That's what happens when you care for yourself and love yourself and get to know yourself. You see other people more clearly because you're not so busy worrying about what it means about you. Do it for you, but if you won't do it for you, do it for your child, your spouse, and the others that you love. If this stuff was easy, if self-care was easy, everybody would do it. If self-care was easy, then everybody would be Yoda, the Dalai Lama, the Buddha. But what is the Dalai Lama, the Buddha, Mother Teresa? What have those folks mastered that we are still struggling with? It's not compassion for others. That's the result. It's healthy self-care. It's self-love. It's self-compassion. But you're going to have to deal with anxiety, fear, guilt. Go to meetings, 12-step meetings, Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. Go to a meeting, go to therapy, go to an intensive to get clear on the project, what you're up against, the programming that you need to unlearn. All right, folks. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be, are available on Amazon. Like I said, the next Finding You Intensive, 2 spots left, was January 15th through 19th. And the Conscious Parenting All-Day Workshop, January 10th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can contact info@findingyouprograms.com for this, for all programming, for all inquiries. And if you want copies of slides, you can email us there too. info@findingyouprograms.com. My next broadcast will actually be tomorrow night. I'm going to do a Q&A. So any questions that are left over from tonight or other nights, you can also send in questions to info@findingyouprograms.com, and I'll read all the pre-submitted questions before I get to any of the live questions tomorrow night. So thank you for joining. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. And as always, for and on behalf of the people that love you and the people that you love, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. It makes all the difference in the world. Have a great evening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.